I'm late.
The story of Ronald Heron, who the world would come to know as Raw Diggs, begins not in a boardroom or a recording studio, but in the sprawling brick-and-mortar landscape of Brooklyn's public housing. Born into a world defined by the Gowanus and Wyckoff Gardens housing projects, his childhood unfolded against a backdrop of urban struggle and systemic neglect. These were not just buildings, they were vertical neighborhoods, each with its own unwritten laws, its own hierarchies of power, and its own narrative of survival. Young Ronald navigated this complex ecosystem daily, learning lessons that were not taught in any classroom but were etched into the graffiti on the walls and the wary glances of his neighbors. A photograph from 1994 captures him at just 12 years old, a boy standing on the precipice of a life that would become a cautionary tale for a generation. Even at a young age, the allure of structure and belonging that gangs offered was a powerful force in communities where other opportunities seemed scarce. For many young men in the projects, the choice was not between good and evil, but between being a predator or prey, between being invisible or being seen. Ronald Heron found his identity within the crimson-flagged world of the Blood Street Gang. This was not a sudden decision but a gradual immersion into a culture that promised protection, respect, and a sense of family. It was a distorted reflection of the American dream, one where success was measured not in wealth accumulated, but in territory controlled and fear commanded. His entry into this life marked the first step on a path from which there would be no easy return, a path that would see him transform from a boy in the projects to a feared leader. His early years in the gang were a brutal apprenticeship. He learned the language of the streets, a dialect of violence and intimidation. He learned the economics of the drug trade, a ruthless market that operated in the shadows of the city's gleaming skyline. This was his education, his training ground. The housing projects, with their labyrinthine hallways and interconnected rooftops, became his domain. He was not just a resident, he was becoming a fixture, a presence that people began to recognize and, more importantly, to fear. The seeds of the man he would become were planted deep in the concrete soil of the Gowanus houses, watered by the harsh realities of his environment and the choices he made within it. The transition from a mere member to a figure of influence was not accidental. It required a certain ambition, a cold-blooded pragmatism that set him apart. While others might have been content as foot soldiers, Heron displayed a capacity for leadership and a hunger for control that did not go unnoticed. His reputation began to grow, first in whispers and then in open acknowledgement. He was seen as someone who was not afraid to enforce the gang's code, someone who understood that in his world, power was not given, but taken. This period of his life was foundational, shaping the mindset that would later allow him to rule his neighborhood with an iron fist, convinced that his authority was absolute, and his actions were justified by the laws of the street, not the laws of the land. Ronald Heron's journey through the ranks of the Bloods was not a quiet one. He aligned himself with a particularly notorious and violent subset of the gang known as the Murderous Mad Dogs, often abbreviated as MMDB. This was not a name chosen for subtlety, it was a declaration of intent, a brand built on a reputation for extreme violence and unwavering loyalty to their own brutal code. As Heron matured, his natural charisma and ruthless ambition propelled him upward. He was not just a follower, he was a strategist, a leader who could inspire both fear and a warped sense of allegiance. His influence began to solidify within the confines of the Gowanus and Wyckoff Gardens, transforming these public housing complexes into his personal fiefdom, where his word became law. His rise was temporarily halted by a conviction on a drug charge in 2002, which led to a significant prison sentence. But for a man like Heron, prison was not a place of rehabilitation. It was a networking opportunity, a university for the criminal underworld. Behind bars, his status and reputation continued to grow. He forged stronger connections within the Bloods hierarchy, learning the intricacies of managing a criminal enterprise from a distance. The prison system, intended to contain him, instead became the crucible that hardened his resolve and expanded his influence. He used his time to plan, to consolidate his power, and to prepare for the day he would return to the streets, more determined than ever to claim what he believed was rightfully his. Upon his release from prison in 2007, Herron did not return to Brooklyn as a reformed man. He returned as a king, reclaiming his throne. The drug trade in the Gowanus and Wyckoff Gardens had become fragmented in his absence, and he saw this as an opportunity to impose absolute control. He re-established his dominance with terrifying efficiency, leading a drug crew that monopolized the sale of crack cocaine and heroin throughout the housing projects. His authority was not maintained through business acumen alone, it was enforced through a campaign of brutal, unrelenting violence. He made it clear that any challenge to his rule, any rival dealer, or any perceived sign of disrespect would be met with swift and merciless retribution. The community became trapped in a state of fear. Residents of the housing projects, many of them families simply trying to live their lives, were forced to navigate a world where Herron and the murderous Mad Dogs were the de facto government. They were the police, the judges, and the executioners. The playgrounds where children once played became backdrops for drug deals, and the community centers meant to be safe havens were overshadowed by the gang's menacing presence. Herron's ascent was complete. He was no longer just a member of a gang, he was the undisputed leader, a man who ruled over his corner of Brooklyn through a carefully cultivated empire of narcotics and terror. When Ronald Herron stepped out of prison in 2007, he moved with a singular purpose: to reclaim and expand his criminal empire. The streets he returned to were not the same ones he had left, and he immediately set about reminding everyone who was in charge. His method was direct and brutal. He believed that to re-establish control over the lucrative drug trade in the Gowanus and Wyckoff Gardens, he needed to make examples of those who had risen in his absence, or who dared to operate without his permission. This period marked the beginning of a violent spree that would cement his reputation as one of Brooklyn's most feared gang leaders. His actions were not random. They were calculated moves designed to eliminate competition and sow terror. The violence was swift and personal. Herron was not a distant commander who gave orders from the shadows. He was often on the front lines, personally involved in acts of intimidation and murder. One of his first acts was to target rivals who had encroached on his territory. The message was clear: the drug trade in these projects belonged to him and the murderous Mad Dogs. According to court testimony, his return was marked by a series of robberies, assaults, and most chillingly, murders. He allegedly hunted down his enemies with a cold determination, believing that violence was the most effective tool for business and control. His reign was built on the understanding that fear was a more reliable currency than money. Among the most heinous crimes attributed to Herron during this period were 3 murders. These were not acts of passion but cold-blooded executions meant to send a shockwave through the community and the criminal underworld. He was charged with the killing of a man named Frederick Brooks, an act of retaliation. He was also convicted for the murder of Richard Russo in a robbery gone wrong, and for ordering the execution of Victor Zapata, who he feared was cooperating with law enforcement. Each death was a statement, a bloody punctuation mark in his declaration of dominance. He was demonstrating that no one was beyond his reach, not rivals, not potential witnesses, and not even those he merely suspected of disloyalty. This campaign of violence had a profound and devastating effect on the residents of the Gowanus and Wyckoff Gardens. The community became a hostage to his ambition. The constant threat of violence created an atmosphere of silence and compliance, where residents were afraid to speak to the police or even look the wrong way at a gang member. Herron's crew operated with impunity, turning public spaces into open-air drug markets and treating the neighborhood as their personal property. For Herron, this was the cost of doing business, the necessary price for maintaining control. For the people living under his shadow, it was a daily nightmare, a reign of terror that seemed to have no end. In a move that would ultimately prove to be his undoing, Ronald Herron did not hide his criminal life, he celebrated it. As an aspiring rapper who went by the stage name Raw Diggs, he took to the internet to build his persona, creating a vast digital footprint that chronicled his exploits. He released music videos on YouTube and posted frequently on social media, blurring the line between his artistic identity and his real-life role as a violent gang leader. These were not just songs about a fictional street life, They were boasts, threats, and detailed accounts of his power. He rapped about his control over the Gowanus houses, his leadership of the murderous Mad Dogs, and his willingness to use violence to protect his turf. The lyrics were shockingly specific. In his songs and online posts, Herron bragged about beating a body, a clear reference to his acquittal in a previous state murder trial. He named his gang, shouted out his co-conspirators, and flashed firearms in his videos. He used his music as a tool for recruitment, projecting an image of power and invincibility that was attractive to younger, impressionable men in his neighborhood. At the same time, these videos served as a tool of intimidation, a public warning to his rivals that he was not a character in a song, but a very real and dangerous threat. He collaborated with mainstream rappers like Waka Flocka Flame, further legitimizing his persona and expanding his audience. Federal investigators, who had been building a case against Herron for years, watched his online activity with growing interest. They saw his digital bravado not as art, but as a series of public confessions. Every video, every tweet, and every lyric was meticulously cataloged, becoming a piece of a much larger puzzle. Herron was, in effect, narrating his own criminal conspiracy for law enforcement to see. He seemed to believe that the guise of a rap artist provided him with a shield, that he could claim his words were mere exaggeration and hyperbole. He failed to understand that in the eyes of the law, his public declarations could be interpreted as powerful evidence of his knowledge, intent, and role in the criminal enterprise. This fusion of gang life and social media created a unique and damning record. It was a modern twist on the classic story of a gangster whose own ego leads to his downfall. Herron's desire for fame and recognition was as powerful as his desire for control of the streets. He wanted everyone to know who he was and what he was capable of. In his mind, he was building a brand, a legend. In reality, he was building a case against himself, providing prosecutors with a treasure trove of evidence that would be almost impossible to refute in a court of law. His online kingdom would soon become the key that unlocked the door to a federal prison. When Ronald Herron was finally brought to trial, the central legal battle revolved around a fascinating and honestly pretty modern question. Where does artistic expression end and criminal evidence begin? The prosecution aimed to introduce Herron's rap videos and social media posts as direct evidence of his crimes. They argued that his lyrics were not just creative fiction, but autobiographical accounts of his leadership in the murderous Mad Dogs, his involvement in drug trafficking, and his role in specific acts of violence. The prosecution contended that these were not metaphors, they were admissions, boasts about real-world events that corroborated the testimony of other witnesses and proved the elements of the racketeering charges against him. Herron's defense team mounted a vigorous counter-argument, framing the issue as a matter of First Amendment rights. They argued that rap music as a genre often employs hyperbole, exaggeration, and fictional personas. To treat Herron's lyrics as literal confessions, they claimed, was to misunderstand the art form, and to unfairly punish an artist for his creative work. They brought in James Peterson, a university professor and expert on hip-hop culture, to testify on this point. Peterson explained to the jury that rappers often adopt gangster personas that are not reflective of their actual lives, much like an actor playing a role in a movie. The defense's position was simple. Raw Diggs was art, not autobiography. The court was thus faced with a delicate balancing act. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech, including artistic expression that may be provocative or offensive. However, that protection is not absolute. It does not shield an individual from having their own words used against them as evidence in a criminal proceeding, if those words help to prove intent, knowledge, motive, or identity related to a crime. The judge had to decide whether the probative value of Herron's videos and lyrics, their ability to prove facts in the case, outweighed any potential prejudice that might arise from their violent and profane content. This legal debate turned Herron's trial into a landmark case concerning the use of artistic expression in the courtroom. Ultimately, the court sided with the prosecution, allowing the jury to see the videos and read the lyrics. This decision was later upheld on appeal, where the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit delivered a crucial ruling. The court found that the First Amendment does not prohibit the evidentiary use of speech to establish the elements of a crime or to prove motive or intent. In Herron's case, the court determined his lyrics were highly relevant. They demonstrated his leadership role, his association with co-conspirators, and his knowledge of the gang's activities. The ruling sent a clear message. While artists have the right to create, They do not have the right to confess to crimes in their art, and then claim immunity from prosecution. The 5-week trial of Ronald Herron took place at the Brooklyn Federal Court, transforming the staid and formal chamber into a theater of street justice and constitutional debate. The prosecution, a joint effort by the FBI and the NYPD, methodically constructed its case, brick by brick. At the center of their strategy was the powerful narrative they could weave using Herron's own words. Jurors were shown the YouTube videos. They saw Herron as Raw Diggs brandishing firearms, surrounded by fellow gang members, and rapping about ruling his territory with violence. The prosecutors played the music and displayed the lyrics on large screens, deconstructing them line by line to connect them to real-world crimes. On the stand, Herron himself testified in his own defense, a risky gamble that ultimately failed to pay off. He tried to portray his rap persona as a work of fiction, a character created for entertainment. He claimed his lyrics were nothing more than exaggeration and hyperbole, common tropes within the rap genre. He attempted to distance himself from the violent acts he was accused of, presenting himself as an artist and entrepreneur, rather than a ruthless gang leader. However, under cross-examination, his composure was tested as prosecutors confronted him with the stark realities behind his words, matching his boasts to specific dates, locations, and victims detailed in the indictment. His performance on the stand seemed to do little to sway a jury that had already seen him glorify the very violence he now denied. The prosecution's case was a multimedia presentation of a criminal enterprise. They didn't just tell the jury about the murderous mad dogs, they showed them. They played videos where Herron explicitly named the gang and claimed his leadership. They presented social media posts where he threatened rivals and celebrated his impunity. This digital evidence was then woven together with more traditional forms of proof such as ballistics reports, drug evidence, and financial records. The combination was devastating. The jury was not just hearing about a crime, they were seeing and hearing the alleged perpetrator boast about it, creating a visceral and deeply incriminating portrait of the man at the defense table. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with tension. On one side, the families of Herron's victims sat, listening to the grim details of their loved ones' final moments. The sister of Victor Zapata was a constant, sorrowful presence. On the other side, Herron's supporters filled the benches, some still seeing him as a community figure or a talented artist being unfairly targeted. As the evidence mounted, the sheer weight of Herron's own words seemed to fill the room. He had created a public record of his crimes with the apparent belief that it would make him a legend. Instead, it was becoming his legal epitaph, inscribed not on a monument but on a federal indictment. While Herron's music and videos provided the shocking centerpiece of the trial, the prosecution's case was solidified by a more traditional and often more powerful form of evidence, the testimony of those who were once on the inside. Several of Herron's former allies, members of his own gang, chose to cooperate with the government in exchange for leniency. They took the witness stand one by one to testify against their former leader. Their testimony provided a harrowing ground-level view of the murderous Mad Dog's operations, and Herron's central role in directing the violence and drug trafficking that terrorized the Gowanus and Wyckoff Gardens communities for years. These witnesses painted a detailed picture of Herron as a hands-on, authoritative leader. They described how he personally orchestrated drug sales, collected profits, and disciplined anyone who stepped out of line. Their stories were not abstract. They were filled with specific details about meetings, conversations, and orders given. They recounted how Herron instructed them to retaliate against rival gangs, and how he personally participated in acts of violence to maintain his grip on the neighborhood. Their testimony transformed Herron from the swaggering rapper in the videos into the cold, calculating commander of a criminal enterprise, connecting the boasts in his lyrics to the blood spilled on the streets. For the jury, hearing these accounts from men who were once loyal to Herron was incredibly compelling. These were not police officers or federal agents. They were individuals who had lived the life Herron rapped about. They knew the gang's codes, understood its hierarchy, and had witnessed its brutality firsthand. When they identified Herron as the man giving the orders, their words carried the weight of authenticity. They described the murder of Victor Zapata, testifying that Herron had ordered the killing because he believed Zapata was providing information to law enforcement. This insider testimony was crucial, as it directly linked Herron to the conspiracy and the murders, something his music could only suggest. The defense, in turn, worked hard to discredit these witnesses. They portrayed them as desperate criminals, liars who would say anything to save themselves from long prison sentences. They highlighted inconsistencies in their stories and emphasized the deals they had made with the prosecution. However, the sheer volume of testimony, with multiple former gang members corroborating each other's accounts, created a powerful and cohesive narrative. The whispers from the inside became a roar that Herron could not shout down. The loyalty he had once commanded through fear had evaporated, replaced by the instinct for self-preservation, and the men he once called his soldiers became the key witnesses for his prosecution. After 5 weeks of dramatic testimony, digital evidence, and intense legal arguments, the case of the United States v. Ronald Herron was handed to the jury. The central question before them was whether the man known as Raw Diggs was an artist exercising his freedom of speech or a criminal kingpin confessing to his crimes. The sheer volume and consistency of the evidence presented by the prosecution left little room for doubt. The jury's deliberation was remarkably swift. After weighing the testimony of former gang members, the expert analysis, and Herron's own incriminating words, they deliberated for only 1 day before reaching a unanimous decision in June 2014. The court clerk read the verdict. On all 21 counts, including racketeering, drug trafficking, and 3 counts of murder and furtherance of racketeering, the jury found Ronald Herron guilty. As the word guilty was repeated over and over, a wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Herron himself remained stoic, his calm demeanor betraying none of the shock or anger he may have felt. His reign was officially over. On one side of the room, his supporters and family members wept openly. On the other side, the sister of murder victim Victor Zapata also cried, but her tears were tears of relief and justice finally served. The verdict marked the definitive fall of a man who had terrorized a community for years. Following the verdict, U.S. Attorney Loretta Lynch, whose office had prosecuted the case, issued a powerful statement. Ronald Herron and his gang of thugs preyed on their community while glorifying their criminal lifestyle, she said. He styled himself a rap artist, but the evidence proved he was a murderous thug who sought to rule his neighborhood with an iron fist. Her words captured the essence of the prosecution's argument, that behind the music and the online persona was a violent reality that had devastated countless lives. The conviction was hailed as a major victory for law enforcement and a significant step toward reclaiming the Gowanus and Wyckoff Gardens for their residents. On April 2, 2015, Herron appeared for the final time before Judge Nicholas Garofis for sentencing. The judge, who had presided over the entire trial, delivered a sentence that reflected the severity of Herron's crimes and the profound harm he had caused. He sentenced Ronald Herron to 12 terms of life in prison, plus an additional 105 years, ensuring that he would never again walk the streets of Brooklyn. In her final statement on the case, Loretta Lynch declared, "Herron's murderous reign is over, and the residents of the Gowanus and Wyckoff houses are now safe from the violence and drug-related crime he unleashed on their streets." Today's sentence put an end to all of that, for good. The gavel had fallen, bringing a final decisive end to the rise and fall of Raw Diggs. The conviction and life sentence of Ronald Herron sent a powerful message that reverberated far beyond the walls of the Brooklyn Federal Court. For the residents of the Gowanus and Wyckoff Gardens housing projects, it was more than just a news headline. It was the end of an era of fear. The removal of Herron and the dismantling of his murderous Mad Dog's crew created a power vacuum, but it also created an opportunity for the community to begin healing. The open-air drug markets began to dissipate, and the palpable sense of menace that had hung over the neighborhood for years started to lift. It was a collective exhale, a release of tension that had been building for the better part of a decade. The case became a landmark moment in the intersection of law, technology, and culture. Herron's failed attempt to use the First Amendment as a shield for his criminal confessions set a significant legal precedent. It served as a stark warning to other criminals who might be tempted to use social media and music to glorify their illegal activities. The ruling clarified that while artistic freedom is a cherished right, it does not provide a get-out-of-jail-free card. Law enforcement agencies across the country took note, recognizing the immense value of monitoring the digital footprints of suspected gang members, turning a tool of intimidation and recruitment into a powerful instrument for prosecution. For the families of Herron's victims, Frederick Brooks, Richard Russo, and Victor Zapata, the sentence provided a measure of justice, though it could never erase their loss. The trial had forced them to relive the most painful moments of their lives, but the final verdict affirmed that their loved ones had not been forgotten by the justice system. The conviction validated their suffering and held a powerful man accountable for the destruction he had wrought. It was a public acknowledgement that the lives lost were not just statistics in a gang war, but cherished individuals whose absence left a permanent void in their families and community. In the end, the story of Rod Diggs serves as a modern cautionary tale. It is a story about how the desperate search for power and respect can lead down a path of self-destruction. Herron built an empire on fear and narcotics, and he documented its construction for the world to see, believing his own myth of invincibility. He tried to become a legend of the streets, but instead became an inmate in the federal prison system, his legacy reduced to a case file and a legal precedent. For the community he once ruled, his downfall was a chance to reclaim their homes, their playgrounds, and their future, free from the shadow of the man who thought he was king.
I'm late.
If you want to know more about the true stories behind New York's most notorious gangs, hit that subscribe button, because in the world of true crime, the truth is never simple, and it's never safe.